Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Kivunim series. My name is Moki Schwartz. I am a senior faculty member at Kivunim, and these lectures are designed to give you a strong foundation so that you can enter our upcoming discussions in class with greater confidence and, I would say, a heightened sense of curiosity. Now, over the many years that we've been teaching, we've seen that students arrive with many different backgrounds and different levels of knowledge about the history of Israel. Now, because our Middle East Studies course, known as LPI, which stands for Land, People, Ideas, builds on a basic familiarity with that history, we've decided, and here we have it, we've put together these 3 recorded lectures to give you the chance to strengthen your foundation. So the question is, what are we going to do together? For one, we're going to explore some of the pivotal moments and influential figures that shaped modern Jewish nationalism, what is known as Zionism, which we will discuss, while at the same time and in juxtaposition, we'll also be examining crucial turning points for the Middle East, and I would even say for the world. And that is the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries, leading into the crucial moment, which is the First World War, and the profound reshaping of the region that followed that war. So whether this is your first introduction or really just a helpful review, the goal that we have is to give you the tools and the context to engage in a more deep and confident manner in our classes and our discussions. So once again, let me welcome you to this Kivunim series on what we can call the formative chapters of Israel's pre-state history and also the making of the modern Middle East, or as the title here suggests, Jewish nationalism and the modern Middle East. As I mentioned, one of the core classes that we teach at Kivunim is called LPI, and I have the privilege of leading that course throughout the years. And in many ways, what we're doing here is we're laying the groundwork for our classes that we'll have this year. I do recommend, as I will in class, that you pull out a notebook and a pen, and what I want you to do is write down dates and names. And even if we don't get to everything, you should have those written down so you can go back and look at that stuff. Now, before we begin, a quick note about how this series is going to work and what to expect. So while the purpose is partially to catch up by offering an abridged history here, my main goal is to introduce you to key names, to events, ideas that will keep coming up throughout the year. Even if something feels like it went by quickly, just jot it down. Names, places, terms. And we can always circle back to that throughout the year, and you can always look these things up. I'll be moving at a pretty fast pace. And again, writing things down is always very important. The goal here is to give you a foundation that you can build on once we are together in classes. So let's start with a statement. And I'll change the slide so we can get to this statement. And that is a very interesting statement over here. And it was actually a statement that our former president, and I'll just point out that Israel has a very unique political structure. And unlike the US, Israel has both a prime minister and a president. The president's role is largely ceremonial, more of a dignitary. And this guy, Ruby Rivlin, who held that office, was a particularly beloved figure. He also underwent personally a fascinating journey in his political views over the years. In 2014, President Rivlin made a statement directed at both politicians and at journalists. It came as a response and as a rejection to calls for French Jews to move to the state of Israel as a way of escaping Islamic terrorism and anti-Semitism. And this statement that was made by the way, the prime minister, deeply angered many people, and President Rivlin pushed back, insisting, "We want you to choose Israel because of your love for Israel, not out of fear." That moment points us to a tension that still echoes in the 21st century. And that tension can be also put forward as the following question: what is the purpose of the state of Israel? This question is not new. Historically, it was framed as what will be the purpose of the Jewish state. And I want you to hold on to that question as we move forward. Now let's couple President Rivlin's words with a very, very different statement, written in a very different time. In 1889, a writer by the name of Asher Ginsberg, better known by his pen name, Achad Ha'am, publishes an essay, and this essay was titled, "This is Not the Way." The year matters here, so jot it down. And he had just returned from a trip to Palestine, Palestina, Eretz Israel. Don't worry. We'll pause soon to look carefully at the maps and at the different names that are being used. At this point, we'll use them interchangeably. And on that trip that Mr. Ginsburg took, or as we'll call him, Achad Ha'am, he visited some of the early Jewish farming communities. These were small groups of European Jews deeply motivated by two convictions. The first conviction was they said, we must leave Eastern Europe. The second conviction was, as Jewish patriots of a new type, we will bring redemption, they said, to the Jewish people, listen carefully, by returning to the land of Israel. This was their belief. Even though their numbers were very small, they were convinced this was the way further, and this was the way forward. But Achad Ha'am, whose writing reached a very wide Jewish readership, was not impressed. He visited these communities and then published a scathing critique, arguing that this premature attempt at national building was doomed to failure. His message boiled down to, if you build it, they will come. That whole thing, that idea, he said, it doesn't work. Instead, he argued, if you build a strong cultural foundation with depth of identity and a shared sense of self, then maybe the people will follow. But what he saw on the ground in those early settlements struck him as underdeveloped, as incoherent, and in his word, as a disaster waiting to happen. As with so many powerful essays, Achad Ha'am's words sparked more than just debate. They helped actually create a small movement. Out of his critique came a small, largely unknown group that called themselves the Sons of Moses, B'nai Moshe. Their mission was to strengthen Jewish cultural identity with focus on Hebrew education, Hebrew literature, and eventually the future of Jewish settlement in Palestine. Take note of this. The B'nai Moshe, this group, Sons of Moses, they lasted until 1897, meaning not even 10 years. 1897, write down that date. It's not a coincidence, and we'll come back to that. But notice something very important that I'm trying to point out. In both these examples, both Reuven Rivlin in 2014 and Achad Ha'am in 1889, the question of immigration to the land of Israel is approached with hesitation. In both cases, we see people wrestling with the same fundamental question, and that is, what is the relationship between Jews living in Israel, in the land they call the Holy Land, and Jews living outside of that land? And it doesn't really matter at this point, the way the question is asked, what the state of sovereignty might be. But nonetheless, the difference is enormous between these two moments. In the first moment, Reuven Rivlin was speaking from within an established state, already celebrating its 65th anniversary. Achad Ha'am, on the other hand, wrote his essay before the word Zionism even really existed. And yet, despite those differences, the core question of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel was alive then, as alive 65 years after the year 1948, the year 2014, and still alive today, 75 years later. So where does one even begin the journey of trying to study, or in my case, trying to teach the story of Israel, the story of Palestine, the story of the Middle East, the modern Jewish national movement? There actually are countless starting points. For example, if we were to ask our dear friend, David Ben-Gurion, and yes, please write down the name as well, the first prime minister of the state of Israel, he would have given his view in a very specific answer. Ben-Gurion famously inserted a paragraph into the Declaration of Independence, which he almost single-handedly crafted. And at the very last minute, which a paragraph that no one had seen before, he added in a paragraph that started with the following statement. In the land of Israel, Be'eretz Israel, the Jewish people arose. Now, whatever you're personally thinking about that statement and whatever reservations you might have about it, the point is that Ben-Gurion believed the story of modern Israel was directly and inseparably tied to the biblical past, which means if we follow his lead, we would have to start our course with the Bible, or maybe with a course about archaeology. By the way, let me assure you, we're not going to do that. We're not going to be doing that. But to paraphrase a wonderful historian that wrote David Ben-Gurion biography, her name Anita Shapira, we'll mention her this year. The fundamental understanding at the heart of Ben-Gurion's doctrine is the idea of a new and old story coming together, that of an old people in an old land, but in new attire, in a new dress. So where is this land? How big is it? Or as we asked, does size even matter? And as you can see, it's very small. Now, let's actually leave these maps behind for the future classes that we'll be doing together. And today, what I want to do is look together at what we're going to call the emergence of the national movement of the Jewish people, known as Zionism. I'll say that one more time. To look together at the emergence of the national movement of the Jewish people, known as Zionism. Now, as we know, Jews have existed in history, as Ben-Gurion reminded us, as a distinct community of faith for centuries, really since antiquity. But the Zionist movement, as a national movement of the Jewish people, only emerges in the modern age, in the last third of the 19th century, primarily in Central and Eastern Europe. And yet, when the Zionist movement wrote the words to their anthem, which eventually would become Israel's national anthem, they declared, as the words of the anthem go, that the hope for Jewish sovereignty, hatikva, the hope for this Jewish sovereignty, or for the sovereign state, has been alive for now 2,000 years. So is Zionism 2,000 years old? And if not, what's the relationship between Zionism and Judaism? Now, most historians are going to explain that the rise of Zionism is actually a response to what we might call the Jewish predicament. The interesting thing is that these historians don't agree on what that predicament might be in the second half of the 19th century. Some would point to social fragmentations. Others, external economic difficulties. Others would talk about political and religious persecution. And yet others would talk about an internal decline of traditional Jewish religious values and life, right? We would call that secularism. All of these factors, we could say, pushed Jews to look for alternatives. And they tried many, many different alternatives to these predicaments. For instance, one would be to immigrate. And immigration to the New World was probably the most famous and the most common alternatives or solutions to the predicament of many Jews, or the majority of Jews of the late 19th century. Others would try what we call assimilation. They would kind of assimilate into the surrounding Gentile societies. And yet others tried to kind of reiterate their religious worlds, and they would hunker down into smaller enclaves of Judaism. This would actually create what we would later on call the ultra-Orthodox movements, to become more religious and more Jewish in their smaller and growing and smaller worlds, growing smaller every day. Others, and this was by far the smallest group, tried to join the revolutionary socialist movements of that time. And even though this was a small group within the Jewish world, many Jews did join this revolutionary socialist movement. So even though we're jumping ahead, we can already see that national aspiration or the national option was only one of several options. And Zionism, as we'll soon define it more carefully, was a particular form of Jewish nationalism, meaning within the world of nationalism, Jewish nationalism was one option. And what that meant, that to be able to imagine a political organization of a state, a sovereign, accepted entity that self-ruled itself, run by and for Jews, though not necessarily exclusively for that group, was somewhat of a utopian illusion. Now, let's talk for a moment, and we'll try to set the stage with a little bit of demographics. Remember that word, demographic, demos, which means the people. Demography here, the study of populations. When Zionism emerges in the late 19th century, the world Jewish population was about 7.5 million Jews in the world. Now, about 90% of those Jews lived in Europe. That's nearly 7 million Jews living in one area. Of those, listen carefully, 5 million lived in Eastern Europe, and about 2 million lived in Central and Western Europe. The remaining 1 or a little bit less than 1 million were spread across Asia, North Africa, and now North America as well. So what does this demographic story tell us? Well, it tells us that the great hub of Jewish life was in Eastern Europe, specifically the region known as the Pale of Settlement. Pale of Settlement, this territory, included what today is Poland, Western Russia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, parts of Hungary, Romania. It was a massive stretch of land where the majority of Jews of the world were concentrated. The region was shaped by certain partitions of old Poland towards the end of the 18th century. And it's here in the Pale of Settlement, in this dense Jewish world of Eastern Europe, that Zionism, the national movement, begins to take roots. So we understand where Jews live, and we understand where much, but not only, of Jewish activity is taking place. And without going into really too much detail, we can lay the foundation in which we can say, and you may agree, but I think you should, that national movements at that moment spread, and this idea of nationalism had spread all over Europe during the 19th century. What happened quite often is that large groups of people started to define themselves by a collective identity, and what they did is they started to invest meaning into their ethnic historical background, right? Ethnic historical data was what was how should I say it? What was something that they desired very, very much. They valued the collective origin, the ethnic particularities, the unique language that they may have spoke. Past legends were suddenly brought to the front. Traditional myths and symbols, all of this came together with a shared attempt of achieving self-determination as a national state. This was not unique to the Jewish group, far from it. These were actually ideas that all nationalisms really shared together, and they kind of tried to look into their past and to find what would determine and self-determine them as a national state. One element that I find very interesting is what we can call a mythological renaissance of the glorious past of every group, right? A fancy way to say we are going to tell stories of our great past. We want to return to our great past. These stories, most of them made up, and definitely the past was turned into this utopia. They were usually not too real, they were mostly imaginary, but this would become a central element of many national movements. Now, why am I taking valuable time to point this out? Well, the quest for a sovereign state for many Jews was to also somewhat ask for a rebirth of a sovereign Jewish state, a going back. This was something that we had already, and we have to go back to what we once had. It was marketed as a return to a glorious past, as an act of, you could say, cosmic justice. It was a powerful story. It was to become an identity. Now, certain Jews adopted this attitude and tried to apply it to the Jewish people. They valued the ancient Jewish past of antiquity as a glorious age of a nation, of Jewish sovereignty. They started to mourn with greater greater zealousy. Their their present agony of the exile was suddenly something that they couldn't live with. And they also spoke about a longing for a future revival of their national movement. The idea of returning to an ancestral homeland was also something that they spoke of with great pride. And they spoke of a piece of land, a geography, which we'll talk about quite a bit. What wasn't shared was that Zionism, meaning what was not shared with other national movements, is that Zionism championed a return from exile to sovereignty in a different land. Because for most of history, Jews spoke about themselves as a people in exile. But to be honest, they made peace with that. They never really aspired as a group to change that status, as an active group of changing the status of being an exilic people. Many of these national Jews spoke about, and here's the term, ending the exile. This, for the majority of Jews, was actually breaking with the Jewish tradition of redemption. Because Judaism, or many voices within the Jewish world for hundreds of years, had kind of cultivated this idea that we have to passively, or a Jew has to passively wait for a divine miracle, a messianic advent of redemption. And the Zionists, they actually adopted active action to build and revive and to move and to actually change reality. The Jewish national movement championed the idea that human beings must be active agents within history and of history. And these are the words that they used, of being active agents within history. Now, besides the rise of nationalism, there was another very important element, and that is that anti-Semitism in modern Europe was to become another major contributor to the emergence of the Zionist movement. Religious anti-Zionism, or anti-Jewish hatred, that saw Jews as heretic sinners in Christianity, and also as inferior unbelievers in Islam, they suddenly found a bit of a change in language. And that language was that the anti-Semitism that they saw was replaced with one could say, multi-dimensional anti-Semitism. And it was a new form of scientific anti-Semitism known as racism. And this would emerge in the late 19th century in various places. It was more visible in Eastern Europe. Anti-Semitism revealed its ugly face through violent pogroms. Please take note of that word, pogroms, which means something like a storm. But it was used to articulate the experience of an organized mob or a riot that sometimes went on for several days. Prestigious institutions discriminated and excluded Jews, and right-wing political parties had very often an open anti-Jewish platform. The news of the spread of violence, which had taken on a new form, as we just said, coupled with the general plea to a better life, which was also something that identifies and can qualify the second half of the 19th century, which Jews shared as well. The promise of a new life in the Golden Land, or as the Jews called it, Golden Medina, the USA, America. And this created a huge immigration wave, meaning the idea that one can improve their life and a new world is out there, together with the sounds of those riots. Sometimes they echoed and reverberated a lot more than what was actually going on. But all of this together created huge immigration waves of Jews from Eastern Europe outside of Eastern Europe. A small, and I mean a small, percentage of those Jews on the move promoted the idea of building a national movement for Jews in the specific land that they called their land, the land of Israel. And there was one more major contribution to this early stage that would give birth to Zionism. Zionism, as we're defining it, a solution to this Jewish problem, which derived from a certain, I'll say, disillusionment from what many would call emancipation. Jews, for many years, over a century, had been promised and tried to fully emancipate into the cultures that surrounded them. And I want you to write down this word, emancipation, because we'll come back to this. It was in many places a formal commitment to grant equal rights to Jews. And what Jews had noticed over many, many years was that this promise, this commitment of equal rights was never really implemented, and it really only remained in theory. So all of these amounted for many Jews, and then for a growing number of Jews after that, in the conclusion that only a sovereign place of their own could and would solve this identity crisis. By the way, there were some that advocated Jewish nationalism, but in a particular Jewish territory in Eastern Europe. Some envisioned an autonomous Jewish community within a certain federation. Again, not in the historical ancestral homeland of Israel. Others promoted the formation of a Jewish state government within the post-revolutionary socialist world. However, and this is what's crucial, the strongest voice in the world of Jewish national voices, what we will soon call Zionism, stressed that there is an affinity and a link to the land of Israel. They advocated a solution outside of Europe, and they really tried to speak about and to convince that it is all about bringing back the Jew to what they perceived was the ancestral origin of the Jewish people. Remember Ben-Gurion, as he said, in Israel, in Eretz Israel, the Jewish people were born. At a certain point, in those early years, the term Zionism will appear. And this term was coined in 1890, if I'm not mistaken, by a certain Jewish Zionist by the name of Nathan Birnbaum. The word Zion, Zion, being a generationally and emotionally packed term, another name for Jerusalem, which embodied both a long historic tie to Jerusalem and in this context, representing the historical geography, also known as the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. And therefore, this movement that will start to grow will refer to itself as the Zionist movement. And as to be expected, this movement was never, and I will stress that forever, was never a homogenous group, not even in its conception years. One group of Zionists would, down the line, would be called practical Zionism. In so many ways, the earliest form of the movement. These were Jews in Eastern Europe, many small organizations that emerged, and they all were under one umbrella term, one umbrella group. They called themselves the lovers of Zion, lovers of Zion, Chovevei Zion in Hebrew. They argued that their members must leave Europe and they must immigrate and settle in the land of Israel. And at this point, Eretz Israel, that they were looking to, we have to remember, was under the control of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. From the early 1880s, remember those years, up to the First World War, these groups, you could argue, advocated a very practical solution to the Jewish problem, namely, to provide a Jewish life by economic productivity, by building social institutions, and creating a Hebrew culture in this new location. They called themselves pioneers, in Hebrew, chalutzim. One of the main ideas, both as a studied element, but also as an actual element, was that the chalutzim championed and revolutionized their life by embracing physical labor, hard work. They championed self-organization. This was their renewed attachment to the land. They had a very positive attitude towards manual labor and agricultural work. In the writings of many of them, scholars have come to believe, for good reason, that these chalutzim were in many ways ignoring the Arab inhabitants of the land. And they had hoped to become the majority of that land that they had immigrated to. What this means for us, which is important, is that we have some kind of realization that demography and geography, they actually go together in this story that we're telling. What do I mean by this? The demographic element in this sliver of land, remember that map I showed you, will actually determine the outcome years down the line of how this land will be shaped by its people. By the way, from the get-go, we can see in the writings of these pioneers that they had this idea that the creation of a modern, sovereign society of Jews would also benefit the non-Jewish population, namely the Arab majority of the land at that point. And it is crucial to point out again that these ideas influenced only but a few thousand, primarily from small towns in Eastern Europe. Only a few Jews, if we think about the amount of Jews that were on the move in Eastern Europe, who committed themselves to building a new society in the land of Israel. We're talking about the early years. Now, although these new let me go back for a second. Now, although this is not the way this is usually taught, nor is this the narrative that the Zionists had promoted from an early point, these early chalutzim did not think in political terms of establishing a state or something like that. They actually stressed the mission to rebuild a viable Hebrew society and to build a culture of Jews in the state of Israel. So later on, when historians would sit down to look at this period, the question would be, how would they qualify the moment that these Zionist Jews started to think in more political terms? We'll see that down the line. But this movement of practical Zionism, the idea that historians put forward is that it starts, and this is going to be important because it gives us an actual year, it starts with what we're going to call the first colonies. In Hebrew, the word moshavot. And remember that word because we will discuss it in class. Why did they use the term colonies? These colonies, these small agricultural farms that were built, again, they used the term colonies. It's not my term. It all begins in 1881, and we're going to come back to that soon. What makes this interesting, at least, actually, I will say what I think makes this interesting, and therefore that I have to convince you that it is actually worth pausing and discussing, is that despite these early attempts at practical Zionists that the practical Zionists had, the founder of the Zionist movement, as a political movement aiming to establish an actual state for the Jews in the land of Israel, was famously Theodor Herzl. He was originally a secular, assimilated Jew from Central Europe. Herzl was a liberal journalist that resided in Vienna, and he, one could say, converted to the Zionist idea following his experiences as a journalist who covered a very, very famous story, which we'll come to, called the Dreyfus Affair. Write that down. This would be a very important point in his personal life, and we'll talk about that in classes this year. What was the Dreyfus Affair? It was a central event that took place in France, whereby a Jewish officer was falsely accused of treason against his own country, France, and he was sentenced to exile. There was an enormous amount of anti-Semitic sentiment going on in France. And this judicial travesty really opened up a public debate in France that ended with, listen carefully, the complete acquittal of Dreyfus 10 years later. Herzl, in his diary covering this event and writing into the German world, he wrote in his diary that he came out of the courthouse and heard the mob shouting, "Death to the traitor, death to the Jews." And this event really convinced Herzl that if such an incident occurs in France, the most emancipated and progressive country, then, as he would write, Jews really have no future in Europe. And after that event, he devoted his life to finding a new place outside of Europe for the Jews. He met with kings, ministers, officials all over Europe in order to try and convince them to support the Jewish mass immigration movement from Europe to the land of Israel. This was called back then trying to achieve a charter. What is this charter? A charter is an official recognition by an official body, a king, a world leader of great power that would stand by Herzl and the Jewish Zionist aspiration. Now, on the one hand, no achievement in his life. And on the other hand, Herzl does succeed in something crucial that is very often overlooked. He succeeds, meaning Herzl died young and never really got to see much progress in the political movement that he was trying to put forward, moving Zionism from its practical early stages into a different stage, what would later on be called political Zionism. But what he was able to do is he was able to build Jewish national institution, Zionist institutions. He founded the Zionist Congress. He created a permanent political, a permanent financial, and a permanent cultural institution, all in order to spread the Zionist idea to Jews all over Europe, and maybe even all over the world. Herzl also wrote two very important books. One was called The State of the Jews, and this one depicted the future of the state that will materialize out of the Zionist vision. And he also wrote another book, very interestingly, called Alt Neuland, and a utopian fictional novel on the life of such a state that might come one day. Herzl's wish was to secure and to create a state for the Jews that would be recognized by international law and would enjoy international consent. Unlike practical Zionists, Herzl sought to establish a state that would precede the creation of the Jewish society. Following the establishment of such a recognized and formal state, the Jews would immigrate and start to build a sovereign state. Therefore, Herzl criticized the immigration and the settlers that we called earlier practical Zionists, the ones that came from Eastern Europe, just like Ahad Ha'am criticized them, saying that they had a premature way of looking at things. Their whole endeavor was really unsuccessful because it didn't have the foundations that it needed. Meaning Herzl really believed that in order to establish a state, you first have to create a Jewish society, institution building. Here is the journal in which the story of Dreyfus came out, the breaking of his sword, the demoting of him from his position, sending him into exile. These are the books that Herzl wrote, Alt Neuland and Judenstaat, the Jewish state, or the state of the Jews. This is the first Zionist Congress. Very important event to point out. And this actually maybe will offer us an opportunity to look at a very specific, untold element of a more well-known story, that of Herzl's creation. He did not create the state. He did not really achieve much in his political diplomatic adventures, but he did do something amazing, and that he called and arranged and hosted a 4-day Zionist conference, which in reality was a real turning point in Zionist history. The year is 1897. He chose a city with great train lines so that people could get there from all over Europe, but mostly from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. And he ended up starting the process of setting up a whole organization with branches and a central bank, an organized mechanism for development, but also for expansion. And there was a decision at this Congress to meet every single year, which means that from the beginning, there would be continuity to these meetings. Now, except for this new institution, the effort of political Zionism did not take off, as I said, in Herzl's time. Most of the Jews in the world that came into contact with the ideas that Herzl brought forward, most of the Jews of the world had rejected Zionism at its earliest stage. There was this late offer by Great Britain, the Empire, to allocate a small piece of land for Zionist settlement in Uganda, or actually in a part of Europe, a part of Africa that would later on be referred to as Uganda. It evoked a little bit of hope in Herzl and in some of his supporters. However, that plan to create a national home in Africa was rejected by the Zionists themselves, the majority of them, who could not accept any idea of Zionism without the idea of Zion. Meaning, once again, geography was very important. It was essential to the belief of what Zionism could be at its earliest state, so that they rejected other offers that came to them. Now, it is worth mentioning that for many Zionist leaders and for many Zionist thinkers, they envisioned that the purpose of Zionism was far greater than its practical and its political aims. I'll give you an example. And in this way, we can go back to Mr. Ginsburg, who we met before, who wrote that scathing review of those early settlers and said, this is not the way. It's terrible what you're doing. He claimed that both practical and political Zionism actually say nothing about the essence of the new nation and its revival. He actually longed for a cultural and a spiritual center in the land of Israel, and that would be the guide of the movement, not a political organization. That would come later. But first, it was all about reviving the state of Judaism in the world. He believed that it is the time to give the Jews of the world new direction and to really save the state of Judaism, not Jews. That was the most important goal, and that really was what Judaism, what Zionism was all about. However, and you could probably think on your own, that the basic problem with this approach is that it had to be translated into something practical. However, even though his ideas never really came to fruition, his writings made an enormous impact on other Zionist writers, on poets, on artists, on teachers, who did strive to do something that to them also was the real essence of this movement, and that is to revive Judaism and to adapt it into a modern Jewish world, into the modern world, by building schools, by writing books, by printing journals, by creating art that was new, that was modern, but at the same time was national and was Jewish. And the last thing to do in order to complete our quick survey of what this national movement looked like in its different factions was we need to also talk about the social element of this movement, what we were going to call social or labor Zionism. In a nutshell, there were a few socialist Jews. That's a lie. There were a lot of socialist Jews, but it still made up for a small number of socialists and for a small amount of Jews in the world. That these Jews sought to integrate the revolutionary passion of that time in Russia with their Jewish national aspiration. If you had to ask these Jews, what is Zionism all about? They would say Zionism, first and foremost, is a Jewish revolutionary movement. And they envisioned the creation of a just society in the land of Israel as a socialist, classless community without the notion of private property. Some of them were real Marxists. Others adopted a social, democratic version of socialism, but they were real socialists. As many of you know, their version of a just society was translated early on in, I would say, later years of the Zionist movement into communal socialist experiments, such as the kibbutz, a way of living that still is in so many ways around today. They also created socialist political parties that would serve in what would later become the Parliament of Israel, the Knesset. They would create very, very strong socialist youth movements, trade unions, and most importantly, labor organizations. And this really brings us back, once again, to our buddy, David Ben-Gurion. Israel's ultimate founding father and its first prime minister, as I told you, was a student and a product of that ideology of socialist Zionism. He viewed himself as a socialist. At least in theory, he did. The imprint that the socialist ideology had on Zionism, maybe this is what I'm trying to say, can really not be underestimated. It is seen everywhere, down to the present. Later this year, we will also mention a very interesting brand of that movement called religious Zionism, but we're not going to get to that in our survey today. It was initially very marginal, but it grew into a very, very important movement. As a summary of this first lecture, in this opening overview, I want to invite one last name into our classroom, and that is Chaim Weizmann, who was the head of the World Zionist Organization at a certain point, and he served there until 1946. Now, this Mr. Weizmann would look at the various versions of Zionism, or as I should say, Zionisms, of this early movement, and saw that on the one hand, the pioneers identified the Jewish predicament differently from one another. And because that they saw the Jewish predicament differently, they also suggested different solutions. And you can think for yourself, what do these different types of Zionism offer? And therefore, what was the predicament that they saw as the most important one that gave birth to Zionism? Yet, Chaim Weizmann argued to the Jewish body in the 1920s. He said, we must view the differences as he called it controversies within a family, which sounds very Jewish, right? You can really have a large debate within one idea. And the reason he said that is because he wanted to promote the idea that they must reach common ground if they want to move forward, if they really want to build a national home. And his ideas, which he would later on call and would be called also by others, to kind of overcome the disagreements of all the different Zionist versions that we spoke of, he called this synthetic Zionism. This meant, at least to him, that as a leader, the challenge is really to promote both practical and political Zionism, with also an ability to incorporate various branches of that movement in order to achieve its main big goal, creating a viable Jewish national community in Eretz Israel. That was really what it was all about. This organization was preserved by its champion pioneers as the Jewish National Liberation Movement. And with Chaim Weizmann, we'll really end our lecture today. And in our next lecture, we're going to start by really looking even more directly at the earliest years of settlement, going back to 1881, and to actually look at what took place. Will be less theoretical and more factual, or not more factual, but more historical in telling an actual story of events that take place. Of course, there'll be a lot more name dropping, and we are going to move very quickly also next class through the early years of this movement, which will really bring us to look closely also at the collapsing Ottoman Empire, and also to look in a more larger way at the Middle East. Thank you very much, and we'll be back for another class soon.